joining us. You have had a very, I would say, non-traditional career path where you started out as a teacher for Teach for America, and now you're leading innovation for Citi. So tell us what the journey's been like and some lessons perhaps along the way.
Sure, thanks. And thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. Looking forward to the conversation. Yeah, I had a very nonlinear career. So as you said, I started out as part of the Charter Corps of Teach for America a long, long time ago. And, at the time I was just really interested in trying to bring change to the system of public education in this country that works well for some people and works so poorly for so many other people. And to be honest, Suchi, I really had no idea. I was a public school student in my life, and I had never experienced anything like the schools that I taught in East LA and in Brooklyn, where there were holes in the walls and it was freezing cold and like just such a difficult learning environment. And so I was super passionate and still am about how to drive change to bring more equity in the education system, which in this country we uphold as the way in a meritocracy for people to be able to get ahead based upon their own work. But we all know that doesn't really hold true. And after teaching for many years, I got really intrigued by sort of the lack of technological innovation in the classroom. Now, keep in mind, this was long before all of us lived through 2020, which is probably the year that technology entered the classroom in the biggest way. But so I got interested in that. I eventually went back to graduate school. And then I realized that, I was in my early 30s and I'd been either teaching or in school for my whole life. And I didn't really know anything about the business world. But I knew that it was really important to know something about it because that was so much of what shaped communities and society. And so I got a job at McKinsey as a consultant, and I learned a huge amount about business. And then, like many people who enter that field, really wanted to operate something on my own as opposed to advising. And so I went and I worked for Yahoo, which was also fascinating, and a company that had been such a pioneer, but also had gone through a lot of different kinds of struggles. And I, you talked about lessons. Man, I've made so many mistakes and learned so many things along the way. But one thing I learned at Yahoo was that it was the first experience that I had that was really about building teams, because when you're teaching, it's just you and a lot of kids in the class. And when you're consulting, you're on a team, but it's more like movie production. Like the team comes together for a project, and then when it's done, it disbands and it does something else. And so I learned a lot there about the importance of teams and the importance of bringing people with really diverse backgrounds to a challenge or to a problem. And after Yahoo, I got into venture for a bit, looking for a small company. And instead of ending up at a small company, I was lucky enough to get recruited to Citi in the midst of the last crisis, and thought long and hard about whether or not to go to a bank. It was the first time I'd ever spent any time in this sector, and thought, well, there's a lot of things that are broken that need to be fixed because people depend on financial institutions all around the world. So maybe those would be things that we could fix from the inside. And have been at Citi for the past 11 and a half years, first running marketing and now running all of innovation. And it took me a long time. I do a lot of mentoring, as I'm sure you do. And people ask about my career because it's kind of weird. And it took me a long time to realize that the thing that I really like is large scale transformation, right? How can you drive positive change in the world in an organization that is complex and multidimensional? And so for me, having the privilege to be able to lead innovation and ventures and productivity at a company like Citi, hopefully means that we can bring new and interesting things out into the world that will make it better.
Absolutely. Thank you again. Thank you for how you show up. I followed you from afar, I would say, and tremendous respect for all your work and yeah, everything that you do. So thank you. But back to the role. Can you tell us a little bit about what a Chief Innovation Officer's role entails, and as you're leading it for Citi, what does it look like, and yeah, what keeps you busy?
Oh my gosh, so many things keep me busy,
That's a lot.
the multiple animals in my apartment who will probably show up during this call. Well, I would say a couple of things. First, the role. It's a great way to frame that question because, we work in a time where it's really hard to know what people do. So I have a young son and he thinks that I talk on Zoom and write emails, which is actually a very accurate description of my job right now. But of course, it doesn't say anything about what I really do. And we'll come back to that because I think it's really important for all of us to talk about what we do, because that's the only way the next generation will have an idea of where they can apply their experience and their passion, because otherwise most jobs are so opaque. But Chief Innovation Officer, first of all, I've always approached this as innovation in a company can't live in one person or one group. It has to be something that you strive to embed across the organization. So even though my team is relatively small at Citi, we work really closely across the whole organization to bring capabilities and even just mindset around change and how to adapt to change. More tactically, we do a number of different activities or disciplines. So we run venture capital investing for the company. We meet thousands and thousands of startups every year. We work with entrepreneurs to help them scale their businesses. Where appropriate, we help bring those businesses into Citi in various types of partnerships. And out of that, we learn a huge amount about where the world is going and what trends are happening, and are able to distill that knowledge and then sort of bring it back into the company. I run an internal incubation program called D10X. That stands for Discovering Exponentially Better Solutions for Our Clients. And it really was born out of the idea that, entrepreneurs want to change the world, but so do a lot of people who don't happen to have entrepreneur in their title, right? So how do you, at a highly regulated global financial institution, allow employees to bring their ideas forward and test those ideas and build those ideas? So through D10X, we've not only launched tons of features and functionality and new products and services, we've also spun out 3 companies where our employees had ideas that we thought would be really interesting for the world, but probably more valuable externally. I run a group called The Studio. The Studio is all about what would happen if you just completely reimagined banking. So, easy example of that, we launched a platform a bit over a year ago called WiBD. WiBD is a skills-based platform. So, as a former teacher, I'm super interested in skills and employment and how people kind of are able to deploy what they know into the world. And everybody's talking about upskilling and cross-skilling. What are you going to do to make sure that you're still current in this changing world? Well, in the US alone, we have $1.7 trillion of unpaid student debt, right? That should tell you that people are trying, right? Like, it's not like everybody went home and said, well, this upskilling thing, I have no idea what it's all about. I want no part of it, right? People are trying, but there's no connection between what skills I have already, where I live and therefore want to work, and what skills I might be able to acquire that would help me boost my earning power. And that connection is really important, because without making that connection, taking all those different pieces of data and putting them together, people make less effective choices for themselves. So, I said, I started my teaching career in California. If I were still a teacher here, I could go on to WiBD and say, hey, I live in San Francisco. I'm a teacher with 30 years of experience. I make $55,000 a year. And I could see that one skill that's really needed in San Francisco, if you want to earn more money as a teacher, is Mandarin, because dual language education is a really big deal. But I spent most of my teaching career in Brooklyn, and Manhattan, and in Brooklyn, Spanish is most in demand. So skills are something that they're really unique and individual. And so why did a bank think about something like Worthy? Well, because banks think about the money that you already have, and people think about the money that they want to make. And why is that, right? There's no real reason for that, just sort of the way things happen. And so we launched Worthy into the world as a way to help people think about a bank helping them with the tools and sort of structure to make decisions about what things could be like. We run a bunch of other things in studio, like internship programs and sort of community building platforms. And then also I run productivity for the company, which is really take all the things that I just talked about and apply those internally to make our employee experience a better experience.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Well, sticking with the theme of innovation, why do you think, especially, I guess, in the current environment, like a culture of innovation is important? Hey, hello.
All right, that was Stella.
No, all good.
I think, yeah, I mean, I think a culture, innovation is really built on a backbone of culture, right? Because innovation happens when people are curious and people feel protected. And I think those two things are really important because in a world that changes, I mean, I used to have to make lots of speeches about how the world changes so quickly. And post 2020, everyone understands that the world is changing dramatically. And you have to be flexible and agile in order to, continue to add value in a world that's changing that way. And that really depends on being curious, which is something that we all were when we were young, because we, had lots of time and support to wonder like why the world worked in this way or that way. And it's something that tends to wane in people over time. But what's great about it is it's kind of like the old adage about learning to ride a bike. Like once you know how, it turns out you can get back on a bike and ride it again. And the same is true with curiosity. As long as you realize that curiosity is a privilege. And what I mean by that is that, if you are feeling insecure in any way, I mean, you can apply this to any realm of life, but we'll apply it to innovation for the moment. You're feeling insecure. You're not sure if your manager is pleased with you. You're not sure if your peers respect you. You're not sure if your opinion is valid. Then those are going to be times that you will not speak up and ask the question about why does it work? Why do we have to do it this way? What if we could do it that way? What if it was better? And so the reason that culture is such an important component of innovation is that it's culture not only that encourages people to be curious, but it's culture that allows for sort of a generosity around that, where people actually have the space to be curious. It takes a lot of bravery to be in a meeting and put forth a contrary point of view or ask a question that goes against the grain of the conversation. But that's where innovation happens, is where people ask those questions. And so I am a firm believer that you have no innovation in a place that doesn't have a culture that supports it, because innovation requires that kind of generosity in order to flourish.
Yeah, absolutely. Completely agree. A couple of follow-up questions to that. First is, when you're at a company, and coming from the SAP world in the past, it's like when you're at a company as large as a Citi or the likes, how do you foster a culture of innovation where people have a certain way of looking at things and they've done things a certain way for a long time? Like, what are some of the tangible things that, from a mindset shift standpoint, that you think have perhaps worked for you or for Citi, if there's anything that comes to mind?
Sure. So we do lots of things, and I'd be super curious for all of your listeners, if anyone has other better ideas, please share them back, because it's hard in a large organization, right? Especially none of us have been able to travel or get together for a long period of time. So in a normal time, I'd be telling you that I'm out talking at town halls and all hands meetings, and obviously that hasn't been the same. But we do a couple of things. One, in our D10X program, a lot of it is about the fact that we hire former entrepreneurs who serve as coaches for our employees. So it's a really different model than, the innovation team goes off and like builds its own thing. It's bringing in that mindset and the skill sets around digital and product, et cetera, so that lots and lots of employees within the bank can experience that for themselves and then bring those skills into their normal course of business.
Sure.
We also, as again, just tangible examples. So myself and our chief marketing officer hold an Innovators at Citi forum monthly that anyone can join or watch the recording of. And we try and keep that kind of some combination of light and hard hitting, meaning I think a lot of what stymies people around innovation is they get afraid to ask. Like the last one that we ran at Citi was around cryptocurrency and NFTs and what's an NFT and why should you know about it? Why should you care? And, when I first started looking at cryptocurrency in late 2012, everyone was asking, like, what is this? I'm not sure. Can you explain to me how it works? And of course, now, people get a little scared, like I should already know that. I'm going to look silly or stupid if I ask a question and everybody else knows. And of course, everybody else doesn't know. There's no way everyone can keep up with all of what's happening in the world. And so we run forums like that to say, like, it's okay. Even if you're a senior person, you have questions. In fact, I believe that the best quality, the best sort of leadership quality is not about having the answers. It's about being able to ask great questions. And so really all the examples I just gave you, and we do many other things, it's really about modeling. Young people, when they come into the workforce, they look to leadership, and it doesn't matter what you say. They will look at what you do and try and emulate that because they want to get closer to where you are.
Yeah.
And the only way you're going to get people who have a mindset around innovation and a curiosity and a ability to share ideas and ask questions is if you showcase that on a regular basis.
Amazing. And the second part of the question was, when you, again, a large company, when they're thinking about innovation, or you mentioned startups in particular, when they're looking at partnering with startups, how do you think about, there's that build internally versus like partner versus like buying something. Are there any things that you keep in mind when you're thinking about partnering? Like what would you build versus who would you partner with from a startup standpoint?
Yeah, really great question, because I think actually startups approach this really differently than incumbent companies do. Startups, both because of the sort of reality of the tech world that we're in now, where everything is sort of modular and in the cloud and components, and because when you're in a startup, you're massively resource constrained. Even if you have a lot of money in the bank, right? You don't have enough employees ever. You don't have enough time. There's you have to quickly beat the competition, find a client, and so that mindset in a startup focuses people incredibly well on what do we want to own, and like what are we going to do that's going to be better than everybody else, and then everything else, if I can rent it, buy it, plug in someone else's, component here. Why would I want to do that stuff, right? I don't want to do that stuff. I want to do the thing that is going to differentiate me. In large companies, both because a lot of large companies were created, were born long before the cloud and long before technically this was easy to do, and because the mindset is often less laser focused on what are we good at versus what is somebody else good at. Large companies tend to have a bias towards building. They tend to have a bias towards, and also I would say because large companies are complex And so it's like, well, that's an interesting piece of software, but it doesn't have this one bell or whistle that fits with exactly the way we do it. So maybe we should build it. So I would say first and foremost, we come with a bias towards what is it that we could partner, where could we bring in a company, be it a fintech or a cyber security company or a data company, or like where can we bring someone in who has got that focus on an issue that we could plug into this massive ecosystem that we have that would be beneficial for both parties. And we do that even within D10X, right? We might come up with an idea that we think we want to offer to our clients. And before we build it, we will do a scan of the market through our investing team and say, if someone's already doing that, great, like let's partner with that person. I mean, I view it as there's so many challenges and opportunities in the world. Like the fastest, most effective way to tackle them is to bring people in and partner, and then really only build the things that you absolutely need to own. But that in and of itself is a mindset shift in any large incumbent company.
Yeah, great points. Thank you. So there's a question. I want to make sure I take the audience questions as they come in, if that's all right.
Of course.
Yeah, so there's a question that came in. Here in the US, we generally think of ourselves as and it's from Reb Thomas, global leader of the innovative economy. As you lead innovation at Citi, do you see the bank as having a big impact on the innovation economy in other countries around the world, like the UK, European countries, UAE, China, Japan, India, etc.? And if so, what are some examples?
Sure. So one of the things that I love about being at a large company like Citi is the globality, right? And the fact that we have not just access to so many markets, but experts in so many markets, and the ability to understand, just like I talked about before, like innovation is not about me or my team, it's about the company. Innovation is not about only Silicon Valley or only Tel Aviv, or right, like there's innovation going on all over the place. In fact, just like trends and themes, it's almost impossible to keep up with. But certainly we try and become embedded in many places around the world where we think there are particular advances. That's something that will be relevant to our industry, right? So there's some kind of hotspots for things that are relevant to consumer packaged goods companies, and that's less relevant to us. But for instance, we're very active in Tel Aviv. We run, not only do we have an investing team there, we run an accelerator, an innovation lab, and that's been true for many, many years, because now fintech, but earlier on, it was such an important place around the world from a cybersecurity point of view, and that's obviously core to our business. And so, yes, I think we could say that we've been an anchor of the innovation community in Tel Aviv for a long time, and we're really proud of that. I thought your question was very generous in terms of how do we influence the innovation economy. I think Tel Aviv is probably a particular location where we are more of an anchor. The innovation economy is massive. And even though Citi is big, I think we're just proud to say that we are part of the community in many places around the world. And we take very seriously, our efforts to help entrepreneurs to build and scale their companies. And to me, that is a lot of the measure of how we do. And that's not just our venture investing team. It's also, Citi at large, partnering with these small companies. That can often be, that first logo can be a really big deal in the evolution of a company. And so I wouldn't say that we necessarily could take credit for shaping the innovation ecosystem around the world, but we're very privileged and glad to be a part of it.
Great. Well, my next question kind of is a follow-up to it, but when you look at trends, what are some of the trends that you look at across the world that you think will be impactful for the financial media industry, financial services industry in particular? Anything that comes to mind?
Yeah,
Top of
sure.
mind for you?
Yeah, I mean, I live in the world of trends,
Yes.
and I think it's a really important question because the information overload can make it seem like you have to pay attention to everything, and we actually use trends or themes as a framework so that as you're listening to podcasts or watching the news or however you get talking to a friend, you can start to see like, oh, wait a minute, like this thing keeps coming up over and over again in really different settings, and now I'm pretty sure that's important and I need to pay attention to it. So for many years now, we've been focused on a trend that we used to call purpose goes mainstream, and I'm now starting to call putting the S in ESG. So ESG, for a really long time, unless you were like deep in it, ESG was largely around green. It was largely environmental. Social and governance were there because acronyms work really well when they have 3 letters, and because the people who were really deep in it understood the interconnectivity of those 3. But I would say, if there is a tiny silver lining to, a really challenging 18 months for the world, it's that the S has become really important, and that's a trend we've been watching for a long time, but I think is now kind of at the forefront, and something that is relevant not just as a side to the business, but really core to so many businesses. So we're watching that, in and participating deeply in it. In a totally different area, we've been sort of shaping and watching the trend of what we call embedded finance for a long period of time. The simplest way that I think about this is, way back when you took your first Uber or Lyft or Grab ride, and the car came and the payment just sort of happened. Like you didn't have to go through your wallet and figure out if you had the right local currency to pay for it. It would just happen because you had your payment credentials already in the app. Was a big deal for consumers, right? And when we saw that, we said, embedded finance is going to happen for institutions as well. And so, just as a small example of embedded finance, we're working deeply on something we call embedded trade. So if you think about all the container ships, I live in San Francisco, so I see them go by all the time. All the goods that are flowing around the world, there's about a $1.5 trillion gap between the physical movement of trade around the world and the financing of trade. Why does that matter? It matters because if you think about the long tail of suppliers and all those small businesses out there who are suppliers to the big consumer packaged good companies or the big technology companies or whatever it is that you've tried to order recently that had a chip in it that is back ordered because of a worldwide shortage of them. Many of those suppliers, those small businesses, can't grow because they're too much on the long tail. And so there's no liquidity that gets all the way down that supply chain. So if you think about embedded trade as kind of the business to business version of embedding your payment credentials someplace, what that gets you is a world that has far more liquidity deep in the supply chain. And a supply chain that has far more liquidity not only helps those small businesses grow, but also provides a lot more resiliency, which is something we've also seen in the last 18 months a real need for around the world. So those are just a couple. There are more. They're more in that well, but 2 that I think are particularly important.
No, that's incredible. Thank you. So my next question is, we talk a lot about artificial intelligence, right? And it's like table stakes, almost everything is intelligent now. But you talk about a concept of moving from advancing from artificial intelligence to artificial enlightenment, which is pretty incredible. I'd love to kind of hear you speak about and elaborate as to why that is important and what that entails.
Sure. So if you think about artificial intelligence, right, it's built on a bunch of technology. I mean, it's been around as a term since 1965. It's had its ebbs and flows over time.
Mm-hmm.
But part of the reason that it's so much at the forefront now is that you've got cloud technology and the accompanying tools in the cloud. You've got, therefore, the ability to manage massive data sets. You've got massive data sets available in a networked way. So whether it's data coming in from mobile devices or just any of the 127 devices that get added to the internet every second of every day of every year, there's all these components that have driven a real set of advances in machine learning and artificial intelligence in the last 3 to 5 years, and that's great. But here's the thing: it turns out that it takes a huge amount of effort to do something as relatively straightforward as teaching a car to cross the street. Again, because of where I live, I see self-driving cars out practicing all the time.
Mm-hmm.
My son is 8.
Mm-hmm.
It takes me about 30 seconds to teach him to cross the street.
Yeah.
Why is that? Because he's got the benefit of thousands of years of evolution and a brain that's wired to understand what data sets are out there. What do I need to pay attention to? An old colleague of mine used to say, you can teach a facial recognition or recognition software to recognize a car, and it'll recognize car after car after car. But if you put one of those car covers on top of the car, it will tell you it's a pillow. And so you start to see that there still is a real gap, and we're not talking here about like very narrow use cases, but for generalized AI, there's still a real gap between human intelligence and artificial intelligence. So artificial enlightenment is asking the question of, what if you took all those same technologies, cloud technologies, massive data sets, the ability to manipulate that data, et cetera, and brought it to people in a way that could help them make more effective decisions. Now, the reason that this has to be a concept instead of just, why aren't we doing this already, is that up until we had those technologies, most of the tools that we had to deal with big sets of data were tools that synthesized that data or aggregated that data. So think about, what's the unemployment rate? What's the GDP growth, right? These are statistics that, frankly, for the average person are meaningless. But their statistics get cited all the time. And why do they get cited? Because they take all these disparate little things, like all the individuals out there who may be looking for a job or have a job or are underemployed, and they wrap them all up into one number. The brain is really good at one number. The brain is really bad at millions and millions and millions of data points where you've got to sort through which ones matter. And by the way, there's some probability in there, et cetera. So what artificial enlightenment does is say, what if we could take those same tools and we could bring the brains walking around in everyone just the data that they need to make a more effective decision. So I was talking before about WiBD. WiBD is one instantiation of that says people want to provide for their families. People know that they don't want to be unemployed. They don't want to be underemployed. But that doesn't help them make better decisions about what skills to acquire. What you need to do is use all that massive data, and instead of putting it into an algorithm that tries to guess who you are, where you are, what you want to do, just give you the ability to make use of the data in situ that matters to you and bring the rest of your capability to bear to make that decision. So it's really not an either or with AI. I mean, it's great that a lot of energy goes into AI. I just happen to have a huge amount of faith and optimism about people's ability to make decisions. And if we did a better job of surfacing the relevant data for that person, you would have a lot more enlightenment.
Amazing. So do you think that...
Oh, you went on mute accidentally, I think. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. My apologies. But do you think that has to do with data cleansing and surfacing, like you said, relevant data? Like how is...
Yeah, I do. So I'll give you another example that's less about individual decisions, but equally important. So we also run at Citi a platform called Citi Builder. And Citi Builder is about helping communities to attract investment that they need. So if you talked to the mayor of Houston, they'd probably say, like, really what we need in Houston is hurricane preparedness, because we understand climate change, more hurricanes. But if you talk to folks in New York City, they would say what we really need in New York City is more broadband access, et cetera. But geographic or place-based investing, people tend to default to the places that they know. So I don't know Houston very well. I might be really an advocate for, like, what do we do to mitigate the effects of climate change? But I think I've been to Houston one time in my life, so I don't have any sense of what that community needs or how I might be able to put investment dollars to work to help that. So there's all this data out there, but as it's not very accessible, it doesn't help me make a more effective decision. So what City Builder does is it brings all that data into a platform that that allows you to get a real feel for communities, or even really like neighborhoods in communities, and see what is it they need, and then you can use your own brain to figure out, like, what are you interested in doing. And so really it's bringing those two things together that allow us to map, every census tract in the country, and allow you to explore any place you want to explore and understand, what do they need? Do they need youth employment services? Do they need, fresh food? Do they need broadband access? Like, how do you kind of pull those things together?
And how far do you think we are from that?
I was really excited early in the pandemic. I think it was out of Georgia Tech. I'll correct it in the notes to this afterwards if I've got it wrong. But there was an app that came out that was not about, like, what is the COVID rate in your state, which is interesting, but not helpful if I'm trying to figure out, is it safe to go to the grocery store, right? What I need to know is not like the California rates. I need to know, in my neighborhood, what's the foot traffic right now? What's the infection rate right now, et cetera. And so this app was basically doing that, was saying, like, it's great that we have all these national and international statistics, but people need to be able to make individual decisions about their behavior, and those big aggregated numbers don't help you. So I was super excited about that. And so, I think there's activity here. I just think that there's so much more that could be done in many different places. There are, there are examples of people doing this where, instead of aggregate weather information, you can use very specific weather information to figure out, when there's a natural disaster, like, which block do you send the first responders to save the most people? Like, so there's tons and tons of applications. And I think if we were talking about artificial enlightenment more, there'd probably be 10 or 100 times the number of applications. So there's always more to do.
Yeah, so fascinating. I'm getting to learn so much. Thank you. I want to be mindful of our time, and I'm going to give audience some time to get their questions in. We have a couple that came in, but Megan, if you'd like to open it up and bring people kind of in the speaker box on stage so they can ask Vanessa questions themselves, I think now would be a good time to do that. But in the meanwhile, let me also read a couple of questions that have come in. You live in a highly regulated environment where which can sometimes be slow at progress. How do you balance regulation and innovation? And this is from Latif Natani.
Hey, thanks, Latif. Thanks for the question. So how do we balance that? Well, first of all, we not only is it a highly regulated environment, but it's even over and above regulation, right? Our clients expect us to do things that are certain, right? So I often use the example of surgery. Like, if you're going in for surgery, you do not want your doctor, while you're lying on the cot with like the tiniest blanket in the world on top of you, to say that they're planning to experiment this afternoon, right? You want your doctor to say, don't worry, I've done this thousands of times. I know exactly what I'm going to do. You're going to walk out of here this afternoon and you're going to feel much better. And banking is like that, right? So banking, people expect us to be predictable, to be repeatable, to not introduce volatility. That's that's part of our role. And so when we thought about innovation, and in particular when we thought about D10X, though it's applicable kind of across the board, we thought, well, you have to, when you're innovating, you have to give people room to explore and to experiment. And when you experiment, sometimes there will be failure. So how do you allow people to experiment in a way that basically reduces the risk to zero? And so really what we've done at Citi is we've created a whole system. We partnered with Bionic at the beginning, and then we sort of rolled it out across Citi, a whole system to allow us to validate the problem before we go ahead and introduce a solution that may be experimental or may not understand the problem completely. So in our case, we do things like what we call demand testing, which is really a way to validate what our clients really need. What are they asking for? How do we make sure that this opportunity is something that we can go after? And we do that in a way that, we're not moving any money. We're not, taking any risk, but we're able to pressure test our ideas. And I think that notion of pressure testing, figuring out a way to pressure test without kind of doing it in production systems. And the reason that I emphasize that is that it's hard because people tend to tell you what they think you want to hear. So the old fashioned kind of focus group stuff is actually a very poor way to pressure test anything, because people will try and tell you with answer that they think you're looking for. And it's not because they're malicious. It's just because that's the way humans work. We're generally kind to one another when we can be. And so, when we talk about validation, we're talking about, pressure testing in something that feels like a production environment, but actually isn't, and therefore introduces no risk. And that's the way at Citi we've been able to, do a lot of innovation without sort of in any way, making the regulators feel like, well, geez, they're experimenting and we can't have them doing something that could fail.
Great, thank you. And my apologies for being a little sloppy, but my laptop is about to die. So I'm going to grab my charger, but I'm going to read the next question so you can answer it while I'm gone. Being a female leader in the financial services, what are your thoughts and initiatives in making sure there's gender diversity in the solutions and AI-enabled financial decisions in your organization?
Yeah, great question. We could talk about this for the whole hour. So first of all, I think, just specifically to that question, and then I'll share a few other things. We believe at Citi, both from a gender perspective and a racial perspective, it's critically important that you not just say that diversity and inclusion is important, but with respect to things like data and design, you have people at the table. Everyone understands the importance of that in AI, right? That if you have a bunch of people who are more homogeneous, creating the algorithms and then feeding the machines data, there's a lot of implicit bias in that. And so you've got to have a diverse group. In fact, we're right now hiring, in case you know people who are interested, for a group that we call READY, which is racial equity in data and design. And the reason that we have design there is it's not just about machine learning and data. It's also about inclusion and how we design technology. It's one of the things I'm really passionate about. I did my doctorate degree at the Media Lab at MIT, which is all kind of applied technology. And it was the first time that I ever realized that tech wasn't just about studying like the theory of computer science. And I say to all the people that I mentor, right, you have to know tech. Like everyone has to know tech, because tech is going to shape all of our lives. And we need, as a society, all of us need, whether I happen to be female or not, whatever race you are, however you affiliate, all of us need a diverse group of people creating those solutions, because tech it calcifies, right? So whatever goes in then is like there, and we're going to have to deal with for the next 10, 20, 30 years. And so it's incredibly important not only to make sure that that each individual company is diverse, but that as a society, we are continually reinforcing that understanding technology is no longer, a choice or something that like some people do but other people don't do. It's a little bit like saying like understanding paper is optional. Like, no, paper is the medium that we use to write things down. Like, everybody's got to understand that. And so, I spoke earlier a little bit about Cupid, our internship program, where we're working with thousands of students around the world to bring the next generation of talent in. And it comes back to what Suchi and I talked about at the beginning, which is most students really don't have a clear view of all the different careers they could pursue. And that's not because the next generation is lazy or uninterested. It's because we live in a non-agrarian society where it's really difficult to understand what careers are. What do people do all day, every day? And so I think, every single person on this webcast, like we all have to think about how we expose the opportunity and what we're doing, what we're trying to build in order to bring diversity to the table, in every possible place.
Amazing. Thank you. And that question was from Sindhu Joseph. So thank you, Sindhu, for your question. The next question is from Juan Zabalos. Hi, Vanessa. Thanks for the keynote and reflections. Very interesting. How is Citi's approach to partnerships with other institutions and corporations / big techs? It can be difficult, one, as maybe these ones are not that symbiotic. And this is JJ from Santander Group, Madrid.
Okay, thanks, JJ. First of all, I would say someone clever on this call, I haven't been able to come up with an answer to this. We need a new name for joint venture, because joint ventures were, the past version of what you're asking about, and 99% of them failed. So most executives, if you propose a joint venture, will sort of say, we're not going to do that. But many of the opportunities and challenges facing the world, and therefore, not just large companies, but also governments, academic centers, they're not going to be solved by one company or one government or one university. They're going to be solved by people coming together. So we don't have a perfect solution or a perfect answer, JJ, to the question that you're asking, but I think it is a critical question. And whenever any of you see models of partnership or collaboration that are working, I mentioned earlier that we do a lot of work thematically with our big clients around the world, whether it's on something like embedded trade or more societal issues. We do a lot of work with clients, and I think all of us, if we can start showcasing those examples where partnership or cooperation has worked, so that we can all collectively start to pattern match, these are sort of the characteristics of the partnerships that worked, and this is what didn't work. I think, there's probably somebody out there who will write the next business book about collaboration and cooperation, because so much of the opportunity and the challenges is going to demand people coming together. And it's inevitable, right? Even in small organizations, partnering isn't easy, but when you're in large organizations, or you have two large organizations or three trying to work together, lining up all the parties is not easy. So it's a real challenge for the world. And I think something that we're doing a lot and experimenting a lot with at Citi, but really open to other examples and where people have seen success.
Right, thanks. And the next question is by Sanjeev Vipani. And thank you for the question. It was part of my questions, but I couldn't get to it. So I'm glad we're getting this answered. You have a background in public / community education and are potentially taking that learning / passion to financial industry. What are some key gaps between urban and rural communities in the context of financial industries? And what is Citi focusing on to help bridge the gap?
Yeah. So great question. Thank you. There are lots of gaps. First of all, I mentioned earlier that there are gaps in terms of employment opportunity, and that's why we launched Worthy, right? Interestingly, mobility around job seeking is down. If you look at sort of the long-term statistics, and so that's sort of a head scratcher, right? When you think, gee, there's so much information, there's all these job boards, there's all this stuff you can go to. Wouldn't you think that mobility around jobs would be way up? And it turns out that part of the answer to that, at least in the work that we've done, is that people just don't know, if I get this skill or I go to this place, will I be able to provide for my family? And that's obviously even more exacerbated in rural communities than it is in urban communities. And so part of why we launched Worthy in the US was to bring sort of a lot of transparency to what skills you have, what's the demand out there. And Worthy, I could go on and say I live in San Francisco, where I happen to live, but I can also go on and say, I live in Columbus, Ohio, just as a little mini experiment for myself to figure out, well, what's the demand in Columbus, Ohio? And so you can use it as an exploration tool to try and think about bridging those gaps. Similarly, there's a super interesting piece done, I think, by the New York Times, but I can't remember because I look at a lot of things like everyone else on this call does, that looked at like county by county maps of all sorts of different statistics and where there was more unemployment, where there was more sort of disparity in terms of wealth by race, by gender. And then they did a compilation of all these maps. And so you can absolutely see, not only around the world, but different parts of the country, people are dealing with different sorts of challenges. And so, we've always focused on, democratizing access, right? Access is one of the key things, right? Like, if you don't have access, then you can't move forward. And whether you think about offerings like our joint venture with Google to increase distribution of financial products, or things like Worthy to increase access to, well, how am I going to make money? Like, what does that look like? I think there's a lot that needs to be done. We're also working through D10X on a new marketplace platform that's not quite public yet, but that really thinks about, how do we in the sector of financial services not make everything so one-to-one? Like, I'm a person and I need this financial instrument, so I'm going to apply to this bank. Think of it as, when I applied to college a really long time ago, you had to apply to each college separately, right? And now there's something called the Common App, and you can just fill that out once, and then you can send it to lots of different colleges and universities, and then you can figure out what that best match is. So think about, like, what could that look like in financial services, and how would that help democratize access more effectively? But there's a tremendous need, so I really appreciate the question.
Thank you. The next question is from Catherine Daly. You mentioned your young son and explaining that you do more than Zoom and emails. As a former teacher, how do you believe we can help our children embrace innovation and set them on the path to be curious in their career and life?
Yeah, so first of all, I talked about before, curiosity is a privilege. Like, make them feel supported, right? All children are curious unless they're hungry. All children are curious unless they don't know where they're going to sleep. And so I think that's really important. Like, just the support, the small things when kids ask questions, figuring out why they were interested in that question. Do they want to know more about it? Just really, creating that supportive environment, and what we talked about before, also modeling it, right? I think, the biggest gift we can give the next generation is modeling that we don't have all the answers, but that we're looking, right? Not that we don't have all the answers, like, we don't care, we're going to throw up our hands and, do something else, but that we're asking questions too. And then going to find those answers together. So whether it's, we have an actual encyclopedia because, I don't want everything to feel virtual and intangible. Like you can look something up in a book too, and you can find those answers. So I think a lot of it is creating a supportive environment and modeling that those are good questions to ask. And of course, sometimes they come at exactly the wrong moment when you're racing out the door to get something done, or and so just trying to have energy around doing those things, I think, is important. And you asked about kids in the next generation. I frankly think it's important that we do this for each other all the time as well, whether you think about your friends and your family or your coworkers, because we're not going to solve the challenges that we have in the world if we don't mobilize everybody. And that includes the next generation, but it also includes all of us.
Thank you. That was beautiful. Gave me chills as you were talking. But we're almost at time, so maybe one more question, and then we can wrap up. You mentioned ESG, also AI. Currently, the resources required to power AI has large ESG impacts. How do you see these two technology futures impacting each other?
Yeah, another great question and a toughie to end on, because obviously, AI is one thing, but when you get into sort of crypto and blockchain, lots of questions about that. I think the great thing is that ESG, as I said before, has moved mainstream. So this is no longer a nice to have. Whether you look at sort of the commitments that Citi has made to net zero, to racial equity, right? Like these are not things that are a side note to businesses anymore. These are things that are front and center for business leaders. And I have a lot of confidence in the ingenuity of people. And so I think, the first thing is recognizing the problem, which you've done implicitly in your question. And the second thing is, describing and unleashing that problem and realizing that, we're not in a static place. The world will continue to evolve, and, there are, lots and lots of smart and curious people out there who will continue to push the envelope on, solving the next problem, right? That's sort of the reality of society. And so I think, identifying those challenges is critical, and then realizing that once identified, we want to give people the opportunity to go and solve them.
Right. Thanks, Kathleen, for the question. And thank you so much, Vanessa, for sharing your perspective and a part of yourself. So really appreciate it. Appreciate
Thanks
your
for the
time.
invitation.
And yes. All right. Thanks all. Thanks for attending. And back to you, Megan, for any closing remarks.